particularly the refugees that have come into that city. Okay, so let me start with Barnabas, who did a study of Cape Town, but is actually talking to us from Grahamstown in South Africa. So hello, Barnabas.
Let me unmute you, Barnabas, I think. Here you go. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
We hear you fine.
Okay, sorry, I'm just joining in now, so I missed the introduction.
That's fine, Barnabas. I was just asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to Cape Town. And then if you just a little bit on Cape Town and what kinds of refugees and migrants are in Cape Town.
Okay. I'm a Zimbabwean, and I've lived in Cape Town in the past 8 years. I've actually lived and worked in Cape Town for the past 8 years, and then I've lived among fellow Africans from different countries, say Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, Malawi, Lesotho, DRC, Nigeria, Swaziland, and so on. And some of the immigrants that you find in Cape Town come from as far as India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So there are quite a number of groups of refugees in Cape Town. But one thing has to be said, Zimbabweans are always the majority.
Okay, great. Thanks, Barnabas. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes, but let's now go on to talk to Nondo and Aisling, Nondo is in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Aisling and Nondo both did the study of Dar. Let's start with Nondo and then go to Aisling.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you well, Nondo.
Yes, my name is Nondo Nobel Bwami, as Prof. Jacobsen has already introduced. And I work with the Salaam Access. I'm the Development and Community Empowerment Coordinator. And I worked on this study with Aisling Oloklen. So we are co-authors. And our case study focused on was looking at examining the vulnerabilities of urban refugees and difficulties they encounter in accessing some basic services in the city, in Dar es Salaam. But also we looked at how their integration is being upheld in terms of urban Tanzanian poor Tanzanians and refugees who live in the slums. So that's our case study focus all about, and we also have some findings to share with you today in line with education and the challenges they face. And I have been working with refugees for almost, since 2011. Now it's 7 years now. So I really work with them on daily basis, so I understand the dynamics and the challenges they face. So for any questions around this, we are available, and we will clarify more on that specific aspect. So maybe Aisling can also introduce herself for this.
Yes, please, Aisling, please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Professor Jacobsen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you well.
Great. So yeah, as Nondo mentioned, we did the case study together in Dar es Salaam. It was my PhD research project, and I was really interested in looking at urban refugee populations because obviously what my research was looking at was the urbanization displacement nexus, and really the difficulties that urban municipalities in particular have in coping with these influxes of population. So I've seen that Asylum Access have already done some work with the urban refugee population in Dar es Salaam, so that was how we ended up doing the project. And I think, as Nondo had mentioned, we looked at the vulnerabilities of the different populations. It was mostly Congolese refugees that we spoke with and compared them to the difficulties that the Tanzanian urban poor have been experiencing as well, because I think sometimes it can be the needs of the host community can also be overlooked when, for example, humanitarian actors come into an area to provide services for refugees. So it was important for us in terms of integrating the refugee population more successfully into Dar es Salaam, so that the host community were considered. So as Nondo mentioned, we can discuss some more about that today. Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe, sorry, can I add something?
Please, yes.
Sorry?
Yes, go ahead, Nondo.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note something for attendees that I am also a Congolese, and I am among the refugee community in Tanzania. So I can be sharing some of the experiences as well that relate to refugee life, and I think that will add value to our findings. That's for clarification before we start.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And then let us turn to South Asia and to India, where Protiti Roy, our colleague in Delhi, has done a study on Delhi. Protiti, are you there? Can you introduce yourself and tell us about Delhi, please?
Hi, good evening. I'm Protiti. I'm a public policy lawyer. I have grown up in Delhi, and I have also worked here. So the only times I haven't been in Delhi was when I was in law school and when I was at the thing about Delhi is that it's a city where there are migrants coming in every day. So there's always been a huge fluidity in the demographics of the city. So whether it's people from different parts of India who are also racially distinct, or people from neighboring countries that are coming in, or even communities from a few countries away or from some of the African countries, it's always been very normal to have a very heterogeneous crowd in Delhi. So short of very obvious politically fueled xenophobia, there has always been a mix of crowds, whether they are coming in as refugees or as traders or generally as migrants. And when the RIT project started, it just seemed to me that Delhi was a very obvious place to study as part of this research project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Protiti. That's great. Let me make one or two comments about where we're going with these cases today. We have three countries here that we're talking about. Two of them, India and South Africa, do not have camps. They are countries without encampment policies. So most of the refugees coming into those countries live in the town. Both India and South Africa are notorious for serious xenophobic attitudes and violence toward immigrants and refugees. By contrast, Tanzania does have encampment policy. Most of Tanzania's refugees, not most, but many are required to live in camps or settlements in Western Tanzania, especially Burundians. But as we know, with encampment policies, most of people, even in countries with encampment policies, most refugees do not live in camps. In Tanzania, however, correct me if I'm wrong, Ishling and Nondo, but most refugees do live in camps. Or, well, maybe things are changing. You tell us. Anyway, we're going to be comparing these countries and these cities a little bit to look at the experience of people in cities, both in countries that have camps and in countries that do not have camps. So, with that difference in mind broadly, let us turn to some findings, and we particularly are focusing on the experience of integration and how education, how school experience of school has affected or has enabled or stood in the way of integration of refugees. So let us start with Barnabas in Cape Town. Barnabas, could you tell us one or two interesting findings from your study of Cape Town that you'd like to share with us about the experience of integration of refugees?
Generally, Cape Town is quite an interesting example because, I mean, at the moment, I mean, when I got to carry out my research, for example, considering the background or the backdrop of the xenophobic attacks that had happened in South Africa, say 2008 and 2015, the idea of integration becomes very, very important when you slot in that as a factor. So one thing that is quite interesting is whether they are documented or undocumented, children who are of school-going age are expected to go to school. That's what the laws of the country require of them. So generally, South Africa is very inclusive when it comes to that aspect of education. But then there are interesting challenges in the fact that you find that the government requires or has a provision for that. I mean, that provision that says like every child who is of school-going age is supposed to be within school and so on. And at the same time, you would find that within the schools themselves, they will be demanding maybe permits that the Department of Home Affairs is not offering on time or offering for a few months, so that, I mean, like, it becomes actually a problem that the students cannot remain within the school without going to renew those permits and so on. So in some of the schools, those permits are required upfront, and then in some of the schools, they're a bit relaxed and they allow the learners to carry on with their education. But then when it comes to the time when they are supposed to write exams, then those permits have to be produced. So like some of the schools here and there are helping the students, link them to non-governmental organizations or law societies that help them to access and acquire those permits. So basically, what is interesting about South Africa is the fact that every child who is of school-going age, whether documented or undocumented, is required to be within school.
All right, great. Thanks, Barnabas. How about Aisling and Nondo? Could you compare, tell us a little bit about the experience of refugees in Dar when it comes to access to schools?
Sure, yeah. Nondo, do you want to start and I can follow up?
Yeah. So it's very interesting because the Islam experience is completely different from the Cape Town's experience, because the Tanzanian law, I mean education law, provides that education, especially primary education, is for Tanzanian children, and this makes it completely, difficult for refugee children in Dar es Salaam to attend schools, especially those children whose parents have no legal status in Dar es Salaam. So they live in hiding due to security reasons. They can't go to camps, and that's where it is believed that in the camps it's a better place for refugees to attend schools. So better schools for refugees are in the camps. So that's the reality in Tanzania. So parents who have children at school age, they have to give the ownership of the children to their neighbors with whom they get along well, and then the neighbors would then register those children as their own children. That's how refugee children get education. But if you don't have any neighbor who is willing to do so, then your children will not be going to school. And so many children in Dar es Salaam have been asking their parents, like, why actually they're going to schools while while my friends, such and so and so and so and so are going to school every day. So what's the difference? Why can't I go to school? And this is actually making parents feel very, very bad. So it is a very surprising finding, and sometimes we were feeling, depressed, Ashling and I. So after hearing all this information coming from parents and sometimes children expressing it very with emotion. So that's the Dar es Salaam case, completely different from Cape Town case. That in Dar es Salaam, refugee children are not allowed to register in schools because if they find out that they are refugees, then they will be deregistered from schools, or they will be given a very, very long process, go to the minister, get minister approval, go to the regional commissioner, get regional commissioner's approval, go to the district commissioner, you get the approval, and I'm telling you, it's a very long process that there is no one who has already made it through that process. So that's briefly the experience. Unfortunately, children are not going to school using the refugee identity, especially primary school and secondary school. It's completely different from towns. Ashling, can you move
Yeah,
on?
and another one of the coping strategies the refugees have as well is that, for example, they ask their children to use Tanzanian names or to try and make their accent sound more Tanzanian,
Yes.
so that they can fit in. Or, a couple of people had described how they had gone to the headmasters of the schools, for example, and, explained that they were refugees and essentially cried and begged for them for their children to be taken into the schools. And in some cases they had been successful. I think as well, this is in the case of primary school. In terms of accessing education as well, there's a couple of other difficulties that, so there's no, officially there's no school fees for primary school in Tanzania, but most children are expected to pay daily contributions for everything from, security in the schools to extra classes and things like that, and they might be about maybe 1,000 Tanzanian shillings a day or something like that, which doesn't sound like that much, but obviously if you have a few children, it all adds up. So this is another barrier. And also in terms of accessing secondary schools, it's a problem for both the Tanzanian urban poor and the refugees, as in Tanzania, you don't get to choose what school you go to in secondary school. So a lot of times you're just sent to a school in Dar es Salaam that might be on the other side of the city. That's maybe an hour and a half on a Dala bus journey. So it's really prohibiting children, if they do manage to make it through primary school, to continue on into secondary school for costs and obviously just the distance and travel. So all of these things really make it very difficult for the refugee children to stay in school consistently.
Okay, thanks for that, both of you, Aisling and Nondo. And now let us ask Protiti about access to schools only. Protiti, what happens in Delhi when refugees try to gain access to school, when refugee children do?
So I'll draw a distinction between the legal right to go to school and the actual practical problems that students face. So under the Constitution, all children up to the age of 14 are entitled to go to school, and no government school can refuse any child of that age group admission. Private schools have to keep at least 25% of their seats reserved for children who have special needs, particularly if they're from an economically weaker section of society. So there are no schools that can refuse to take in a child irrespective of nationality. If they're in India, they have a right to go to school. The problems, however, are first of all linguistic, because in Delhi, schools teach either English or Hindi as the medium of instruction, and there's a second language. So if it's an English medium school, the second language will be Hindi, which is the regional language. Or if it's a Hindi medium school, then they will teach English as the second language. Language then becomes a huge problem for students from other parts of the world or the country who are not familiar, and these are not necessarily 4-year-old kids who are just entering the education system and they can learn the language as they go. These kids may be in middle school and they are already grounded in thinking in a specific language, and they do not, and like to learn a language from its basics becomes really difficult. So it's hard for them to keep up in school. The other problem is financial, because even if the schools do not charge a fee, there's the cost of uniforms, of books, of transport. There's generally the opportunity cost of having an older child stay at home and help out in earning some money for the family. Another problem is that parents in Delhi, whether of refugee children or generally, would prefer to put their children in a private or a semi-private school rather than in a government school where the quality of education is not good. So that adds on to the financial costs of education. So all the women I spoke to in during my research, who were all single mothers mostly, they kept emphasizing how much they need to earn, how badly they need to earn more so that they can keep their children in school and so that they can ensure that their children get a good education or a better education than they have right now.
Okay, great. That's great. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. Clearly, language is an issue in terms of experiencing school. I'm wondering if we could talk now about the ways in which being in school with children or young people contributes to integration or not. I mean, does the experience of being in school, particularly with language problems, but also learning language in school, how would you assess the experience of children in school as a factor in their own integration and also in their families and their parents' integration? Barnabas, let's start with you because you had some interesting examples and anecdotes to share about your experience with different immigrants and refugees in the schools in the high schools in Cape Town. And by the way, why don't you tell us that you went to 4 high schools to talk to students there, right?
Yeah, that's right. These schools are basically English medium schools, but then they do have an option of a second language, which is either Afrikaans or isiXhosa. And students have to be fluent in any of these languages, or at least they make an effort to learn them because they are actually examined and they are a requirement should they want to pursue their education into university and so on. So for me, I mean, the effort was really there, and I mean, the effort is really there on the part of the immigrants to learn the language. And I've also found something quite interesting that, I mean, like, while the immigrants are actually learning South African languages, Afrikaans and isiXhosa, they are also teaching the South Africans their languages. So, like, there is a bit of a mutual benefit and a very good relationship between the South African kids and the immigrants within these schools. To such an extent that the other day I was actually talking to these other girls from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and their first language is Lingala. So their South African friends came while I was speaking to them, and they greeted me in Lingala because they thought I could speak their language. So that was very interesting for me. It really showed me that there's a very good relationship. Students are benefiting from one another.
It's interesting, Barnabas, and you also had some interesting observations about the choice of language, and ended up recommending that it may be more valuable to, rather than learning local languages, actually learning, say, French or other languages that may have more economic opportunities. So there's this interesting divide between, you know, economic integration versus cultural integration and choosing which language to learn. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, that's right. I was looking at Cape Town as a cosmopolitan city. Basically, there are quite a lot of students who are coming from maybe Angola and Mozambique who actually speak Portuguese, and those who are coming from Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo Brazzaville, and then a lot of countries from West Africa, say Senegal, Mali, and so on, and most of them speak French. And these students are actually struggling when it comes to learning English itself in these English medium schools. And as such, some of the parents prefer to have them getting some extra lessons, maybe in French from tutors, because out of all the schools that I was looking at, only one school offers French within the school premises. So some of them do recommend students to tutors outside. And then one of the schools actually said, like, we don't even have any policy of, we don't even make an effort to try to help them. But then, like, obviously, I was actually recommending that probably some of the schools should start teaching French, because, I mean, like, in the event that these students are not to become or to stay within South Africa in the future, obviously they will go back to their country, and then all of a sudden, if someone has learned English, for example, and they are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then going back to a French-speaking country like that, probably the English becomes useless, and still they actually want to be integrated within the community back home. So it would be okay for them to be taught maybe French in some of the schools in South Africa, so that at least the other advantage with French is it is a language that is, I mean, it's a global language. No matter how much people can talk against it, like considering what is going on within South African universities and schools at the moment, there's so much talk about decolonization and decolonizing the languages and something like that. So people would prefer to learn in local languages, but then that doesn't, I mean, they are not being accommodative, or they're not considering students who are coming from foreign countries.
All right, great. Thanks, Barnabas. It's so interesting. We'll get back to some of these issues. Nondo and Aisling, can you talk about language in the schools, or yeah, I mean, some of the issues that you wanted to raise about the experience of children in the schools, and whether that's helping with integration, or is it other too much? Can you talk about that, and maybe also a little bit about the language experience? I know we've got many Congolese and Burundians who speak French, are likely to speak French rather than English in Dar. So can you talk about that?
Oh yes. So the language is always a barrier in Tanzania to access education, and the Swahili is most languages spoken in Dar es Salaam, and many refugee children speak either French or their native languages. And as per our study findings, that the parents try as much as possible to tell their children to cope with Tanzanian accent of Swahili. And not all children speak Swahili from home, but some speak French from home. So going to an English-speaking school or Swahili dominated school it is challenging for children to cope. But they try hard to so if they are told with parents that this is the best way for you to get out of trouble when you are at schools, they try hard, they cope, and they engage with Tanzanian colleagues at school. But still the accent at the beginning is noticeable, and that will make them somehow feel discriminated because at the beginning they won't have that much with the other children, because they feel they feel that they can easily be noticed, that they can easily be discriminated against, and so that makes children to actually concentrate a lot and not be that much freer to express themselves or to join other children groups. For those who succeed to join the school, so those are the things that we are in. Actually, it's what we hear even in the office, because sometimes parents will come and ask me, for example, for advice. Like, you are a brother. You are a brother to me. Tell me exactly what should I do in this situation. What can I do as a brother? And sometimes they will tell you things that actually are overwhelming and that you cannot. There is nothing you can do about that. It is only accepting the reality and face the reality, and then learn through experiencing the reality. So, but the little that you advise, they will appreciate for that. So language is a barrier for people coming from DRC, especially people who come from Kinshasa regions and the western part of DRC. It will be much less, problems if they come from the eastern part, because the eastern part of DRC, they speak Swahili, and the Burundian also speak Swahili, but the accent is different, but at least they can easily adapt. But for those children coming from western part of DRC, like people come from Kinshasa and the bordering regions there, they really don't even know any word of Swahili, and they will then be supposed to be speaking Swahili. So it is very, very challenging for them.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add as well, briefly, that in addition to the problems with language integration in the school as well, quite a few parents had also mentioned that they felt the quality in the Tanzanian schools wasn't as high as it had been in DRC, for example, and that was also an issue, that obviously there's no French speaking public schools in Dar es Salaam, for example, and some of the parents had mentioned that they would really like to see this, and that they felt that it would also maybe improve the quality of education that the children were receiving. For example, we also had one of the refugees that we interviewed had actually started teaching in one of the schools in Dar es Salaam, but when it was discovered that he was a refugee, he was let go from that position. So it's I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the schooling system in Dar es Salaam generally, both in terms of the access for refugees, but also in the general quality of education that children are receiving, and obviously, as we mentioned already, the financial pressures. And I think the difficulty in terms of changing policy is that, for example, if it was suggested to build, for example, French-speaking schools or Lingala-speaking schools or whatever in Dar es Salaam, is that the urban authorities would then be recognizing the fact that there is quite a large urban refugee population in the city, which up to now they haven't really been willing to do. Like that they're aware that there is a large number of refugees, but because it's they're trying to blend in very much in the city, it's not really come to the fore in terms of urban authorities trying to make policy changes and these kind of things. So I think it's interesting how these kind of problems that come up with education, and probably will continue to do so for a long time until there is more of an engagement from the urban authorities that there is actually an acknowledgement, I suppose, that there is actually a large urban refugee population in Dar es Salaam.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Let's just ask Protiti to talk about a bit more about language in Delhi and how refugees negotiate this problem in the schools.
I have two very contrasting examples of refugee children in schools. One set of children were the daughters of some of the Afghan women I spoke to. They had a lot less trouble picking up Hindi. It's closer to their local languages, and they were able to pick it up. Both parents as well as the children were able to pick up the language with a fair amount of ease. These girls are now in high school and having the time of their lives. They are popular because they are pretty, and they are able to speak the language. They are, with their peer group, they are integrating into a similar sort of fashion, and the mothers are very indulgent. One of them said, if my daughter has freedom to wear jeans and sleeveless clothes, if she doesn't have to cover her face here, then who am I to stop her? So these girls are having a really good time in school. On the other hand, I spoke to a group of women from Somalia. Their children are younger. They are in middle school or just finishing primary school. They have picked up English very well, but the kinds of schools that the parents can afford to send them to are not English medium schools. So in a Hindi medium school, to be racially distinct and also not be able to speak the most popular language sort of puts them into this corner, and often other students are really mean to them, and a lot of the name calling involves racial slurs, and they don't make a whole lot of friends outside their own refugee community. So for them, it was a very different experience as compared to the girls who were able to speak Hindi very well very soon.
So Ticha, that is so interesting, and it's a wonderful segue to my next question for you all, which is to talk about in these three huge cities. Well, Cape Town's not that huge, but I mean, it's getting there. What we're seeing in these cities is, I can say this about Cape Town because that is my own city of birth, so I can say whatever I want about that. So in all of these cities, we see many different groups of refugees, many different refugee nationalities, and Protiti has just referred to Somalis and Afghan refugees. Very different experience, and the others have all talked about, Congolese, Burundians, Somalis in Dar es Salaam and in Cape Town. You Barnabas mentioned many different African nationalities and also from Asia. So can you talk a bit about how this different experience, these different groups, really gave us excellent examples of how Afghan girls going to somewhat better off English medium schools are doing well. The Somalis in the poorer Hindi-speaking schools are not doing well. Can you give us some examples about that? I know, Barnabas, you talked about Somalis doing their own schools in Cape Town. Barnabas, can you talk about that experience of differentiation amongst refugees?
Yeah, for me that was very interesting to find that in all the schools that I carried out my research, there were no Somali children. I had to ask, even consult the Somali Association of South Africa, and I realized they've started their own school in Belleville, and but then I didn't get responses as to whether they did it as a way of creating a safe zone or did it for some other reason. Even the non-governmental organization that is said to have helped them create that school, which is called Calabrini Center, could not also give me a favorable response. But then with the other immigrants, you'd realize that some of the schools have probably a higher ratio of immigrants from a certain country, simply because people from that particular country prefer to stay within a certain neighborhood. Like, okay, within the townships of South Africa, by townships I mean these low-income areas where you find the majority of the blacks of South Africa, you would find that people from Zimbabwe and maybe Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, and so on, stay within these communities, and their children can be able to go to schools that are in those areas. But then there are certain people, certain immigrants, say from Nigeria, who find it very hard to speak the local languages here, or from Congo, who find it hard to also speak the local languages here. They don't stay within these communities. They prefer to stay within certain areas. So like their children tend to go to a certain school that is probably near that area and so on. And in most of these cases, very few black South African kids would be within that school. Mostly, it might be maybe schools of, those schools mostly have maybe white children, and then in South Africa they also classify the mixed race as coloreds, and so basically coloreds and whites, and then immigrants. And then you find the schools in the townships, that's where you find a lot of black South Africans.
Okay, great. Wonderful examples there. Thanks, Barnabas. How about our colleagues in Dar? Nondo and Aisling, some examples there about differentiation of different groups there?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I think it's almost the same in terms of communities living in some areas and trying to do things that are similar. And for example, you will see if you go in a certain area, you will see it's mostly dominated by maybe Congolese, and then other areas are mostly Burundians areas, and others are mixture. And then, for example, for the school, we had what we call a call francophone de Grand Lac, that is Great Lakes French School, and so this was mainly to help Congolese students and other students coming from Great Lakes region that speak French, including Tanzania, for those Tanzanians children who wanted to learn French, to attend that particular school. But the problem with school is first the status of students themselves, and the status of teachers who are also refugees without legal status, and the registration of the school that requires people with legal status, to register school. So the school remained unregistered, and it hit legal problems with the government. So it is there, but clandestinely. And another problem with that grouping is that could be refugees would be easily tracked by immigration officers, for example, through that school. So parents were very, very reluctant, and also the fee of the school was very high. And this is something that we did not, forgot to mention that it is completely complicated for refugee children in Salaam to join government-owned schools, but they could easily join private schools, but then the fees are very, very higher. And even this French school is also part of the private school where fees is also higher. So this grouping is much more of support group where if I say, for example, funeral, they want to live together in one area so that to support each other during the moment of sickness, funerals, and things alike.
All right, great. Aisling, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Nando's covered it well there.
Okay, great. And Protiti, you started us off on this. Did you want to add anything about the different groups and their experience in Delhi?
I could add on about another group that I spoke to who were Chin Burmese. And that was a very emotional set of interviews because for them it was both the problem of poor finances and the lack of linguistic abilities, which were sort of reinforcing each other at every stage. So because the mother couldn't speak Hindi, so she could only sell her food items to other Chin Burmese people, so she was consequently earning very little since, nobody in that community has a lot of money at this point of time. And that just kept, and then because she was earning that little, she actually needed her daughter to stay at home and help her prepare the food that she would sell the next day. So the child couldn't go to school, and because she wasn't going to school, she had no exposure to either English or Hindi at all. So every time she tried for admission thereafter, in every successive year, she was just getting older, the language levels at school were getting more difficult, and it just kept getting worse with every passing year. And this particular mother started crying, and she said, when families stay together, they are able to send about 7 children to school, and I, as a single mother, can't send my one daughter to school. And she was crying so much about that.
Gosh, Priti, that's a very sad story, and we've heard these stories over and over. My own experience in Cairo recently, where single women refugees, single mothers, were unable to have their children go to school because they had to stay home and help them, and those children also are being left behind. To say nothing of the mothers themselves who are so isolated and unable to learn the language. I think these are really, really important issues, this whole problem of language and as an aspect of integration. We have just a few minutes left of this webinar today. We hope that anybody who's out there listening if you have any questions, let us know, please. We'd love to raise them to our participants. Just type them into the little chat message box there. Meanwhile, while we wait for questions, one last thing I'd like to ask you all is if you have any comments on the experience of tensions or lack of tensions between the host population, between the local population in your cities and the refugees. Would you say that that relations are getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they the same? And what is that? How would you assess those relations, and what do you think are drivers or factors that are changing relations between the refugees and hosts? Let's start with Barnabas again, since we're going in that rotation.
For me, what I realized basically is there's a lot of tension, especially with older people who happen to be, the parents. They sort of perceive refugees or immigrants as people who are coming to take their jobs. They're putting pressure on their facilities, whether it is the housing facilities or hospital facilities and so on, anything that they share. And also they actually blame foreigners for sort of fueling the drug problem in South Africa and so on. But then you would find that while this tension is among the older people, the situation is very different within. I mean, the situation is very different with the children, because basically they learn with each other, sit next to each other in class. They also have foreign teachers here and there whom they look up to as role models, and I actually realized that with students, I mean, there's that respect for one another, and a very good relationship, very good friendships, and so on, which is different with older people.
It was interesting in your study that you talked about how the refugee teachers themselves, who were from these other countries, became these role models even for South African children, and how that there was a lot of respect that many of these refugee teachers had, and which really seemed to be breaking down some of these more xenophobic attitudes. Would you say that was going on?
Yeah, that's right. That's very true. To an extent, I think it's really helping a lot in bringing people together within these societies.
Great. Okay, how about Nondo and Aisling? What was your experience with tensions or lack of tensions or easing of tensions between hosts and refugees?
I think it was, sorry,
Go ahead.
I think it was really interesting what we found, because there seems to be quite a difference in viewpoints between the Tanzanians and the refugees. So when we spoke to Tanzanians in focus groups, for example, people generally weren't aware that there were refugees in Dar es Salaam. A lot of people hadn't met any refugees, didn't just assume that everyone was in the camp. And when you ask them, how would you feel about refugees being in the city, very few people were outright against the idea of refugees living in Dar es Salaam. Most people said, as long as they're here legally, as in they have papers from UNHCR, and they're not criminals, they're not going to cause any trouble, then we wouldn't have a problem with them. Particularly the idea around legality and having refugee status seems to be really important to people. But then when we spoke to the refugees themselves, then, it was quite a different story in some cases, that, people said they'd been discriminated against at work by their neighbors in some cases. There's a lot of instances of refugees being arrested by the police and had to pay bribes and rearrested again, and this kind of ongoing thing by police to just get money for themselves, basically. So it was quite interesting in terms of how a lot of the Tanzanians viewed refugees in theory, the ones that hadn't met, and then obviously the actual refugee experience. So maybe Nondo can speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, so just to add on what Aisling just mentioned, that tensions maybe it's more of in terms of refugee identity, versus nationality. For example, if you say, Tanzanians would like more to hear about, for example, I'm a Congolese, or I'm a Burundian, or I am a Ugandan, rather than saying I'm a refugee. Because if you say I'm a refugee, and if you rent somewhere, that would cause the problem of eviction, for example. And then we say, I don't want to stay with refugees here, and that could lead to you being evicted from the house, or it could be prone to a rent increase. So those kind of tensions, and then Asylum access, for example, now out of the case study, but those are the things we have in the case studies, and they reflect actually what we are hearing at Asylum access. We now initiated a project that, for example, they're working together about Good Neighbor Awards, where we recognize the effort of those Tanzanians who do better things for refugees, to be smoothly integrated into society, and then we could recognize their efforts, and also recognize the joint initiatives between a refugee and a Tanzanian, to manage those tensions and to also give refugees chance that they be perceived as contributing rather than being seen as burdens to Tanzanians. So most tensions are on case-by-case basis, and it's more of refugee identity versus nationality. So that's what I would say.
Okay, great. We have a bunch of questions, but I just asked Protiti quickly to respond to this. Protiti, I just rashly said that Delhi was also a xenophobic city, but is it the case that it's xenophobic toward refugees, or is it just more religious identity xenophobia there?
So that's a very, very interesting point, and I think that's the moot point here, that it really all comes down to politics at the national or the local level, though local level politics is usually more on infrastructure development issues. But the national politics, so long as we have governments that are all about integration and communal harmony, and like we are for everyone and we need everybody's votes, those kinds of governments are also equally welcoming of refugee communities. And with the present government, which has a very religious nationalist approach to politics, there's a general pushback against a certain religious group, and it just so happens to be a lot of the refugee communities belong to the same religious group, so there's an equal amount of pushback against them as well. The Tibetan refugees, on the other hand, do not face this pushback. So Buddhism is nice, it's very close to Hinduism, we are all friends and they are good, and like everybody wants to go to the Tibetan colonies and eat Tibetan cuisine, that's very popular. On the other hand, particularly say men from Afghanistan, the security situation is getting really difficult with the current pushback, the current sort of tensions within the country between Hindu and Muslim groups. It's a lot easier for other religious groups to be refugees in India. In fact, the government, I think, beginning of 2016 or end of 2015 came up with this crazy idea that if you're a Hindu refugee, you are welcome, but if you're a Muslim refugee, your processing is going to just take that much longer, which is very funny because the government doesn't even process refugees. UNHCR does that in India. So we have all these kinds of tensions that sort of get projected onto refugee groups, so they are basically at the mercy of whatever national level politics is going on right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Protiti. Those are all really interesting observations. We have a number of questions coming in. What I'll do is field all of them and let you sort of answer. Some of them are going to be more relevant to different ones of you. We have one question about relative safety in camp settings versus urban settings. Noting that in Thailand there's a big discrepancy between how safe a refugee might be in a camp versus living in a city. So you might talk about the trade-offs in safety versus other opportunities that might come leaving a camp and going into a city. We have a question about, was the theme of education set out in advance? In these cases, we let each researcher choose which domain they want to focus on. So maybe you could talk about why, Barnabas, you found education so interesting for your case. In Dar es Salaam, they were focusing more broadly at a number of domains. Protiti, you might talk about why you chose cooking and culture as a more interesting domain of integration to focus on, with education kind of ended up tying into that. Let's see, our last question was about the risk of deportation, what it is about being a refugee, specifically in Dar es Salaam, that eviction, that puts you at risk of that. So I don't know if you have ideas how we want to sort this out. Does anyone want to go ahead and take one of those or several of those questions?
I will start on education.
Great, thanks, Barnabas. Go ahead.
Okay, basically for me, this was quite an interesting topic because when I moved from Zimbabwe coming to South Africa, I was very much interested in furthering my education. So I started working and then going to university as well because I initially went to Stellenbosch and then went to the University of Cape Town. But then while I was pursuing my education and also going to work and also like the neighborhood within which I stayed, I actually had a lot of immigrants who were neighbors and so on. So I actually realized like they had some challenges because I mean some of them would come and ask for assistance. Like I had this other lady who is a neighbor who had her children in some of the schools in along Fort Tracker Road, and she used to come to me and ask me to assist the kids, and then I would interact with them, talk with them, and then realize like they are facing these challenges in school. And also I happened to stay with these other some Congolese brothers at some point, and then I realized they also had challenges of a different kind in their schools. So for me, education really became an option. I really wanted to see whether the problems that were existing then are still existing, or there are some changes that are happening within the school. So it just became a natural option, sort of.
Great. So it just emerged organically.
Yeah, definitely.
Protiti, do you want to talk about a little bit about why you chose cooking and culture as your focus and how education ended up getting connected to that?
Sure. What I started out with was a gut feeling that when you're away from home, home food means a lot more to you. That was definitely my experience as a student in different countries, and I was very curious to know if people who are more permanently displaced have that kind of feeling. In my family, my grandparents had to cross over as refugees when India was partitioned in 47, and they hold on to their cuisine very dearly. So I thought that would be an interesting question to explore, and it seemed that also when, as consumers, we went out into the market, there was a very niche and upcoming category for like specialized cuisines. And the more unique the cuisine was, the greater was its demand. And it's been happening a lot in Delhi that people are looking for, Somali cuisine. So that's one Iraqi restaurant in one corner of one street. So there's a very niche but very upcoming market for that, and I wanted to know more about it. How it came down to education was that I was the local organization that I partnered with to do this research was Access Development Services, and they work a lot with single women. And they had single women who were providing catering services or cooking at food stalls to support their families. So initially it was a lot about being a woman. Cooking is something I know how to do. It's a skill I just have because I am a woman. Then it went on to how does this income support help you, and is it enough? And that's where the education of the children came in. It's all about giving the kids a roof and sending the kids to school. That is all most of these women cared about. So that's how a lot of the conversations about education started coming in.
It's really great. I think these are great examples of how integration is this big umbrella term, but then little components of it are more relevant in different local contexts, and it varies. You need these local researchers to understand the interrelations between education and income and which aspects of integration are most relevant. Ashlyn and Nondo, do you want to take on the question of camp versus non-camp safety and the eviction question?
So what I would say for both questions, for starting with question one, about safety in the camp versus in urban areas. First, it depends on someone's level of insecurity, and I wouldn't blame anyone being in the camp or being outside the camp. So because it depends on the level of insecurity, because some people, they feel and they have objective fear of being in the camps. And so if they're in the camp, they feel that they are not safe, and the camp's borders, the country of origin, it's more clear that if someone has serious safety concerns in the camps, it is near the countries of origins. So they feel more safe if they are very, very away of the camp. Their countries of origin, like Dar es Salaam, which is on the other extreme of, so camps are on one starting point of the country, and Dar es Salaam is at the other last part of the country. So they are very far away. That's one. And so one can feel more safe in the camp because there is no much risk of persecution or being kidnapped by what they feel could be perpetrators. So coming to Dar es Salaam, that's where they feel more safe, and it is anonymous. You can just live and keep a low profile, and you live with other people, and then nobody will know your whereabouts. Will easily know your whereabouts, so they could easily hide in Dar es Salaam and see their safety being guaranteed being in Dar es Salaam. So it is not a question of saying it is more safe to be in the camp than being in Dar es Salaam, or it is more safe to be in Dar es Salaam than being in the camp. So I would say it depends on the level of someone's fear or insecurity according to their flight histories. So that's one. But in terms of eviction, and before that, actually, people who are deemed by the government to have safety concerns in the camp, and these safety concerns checked and verified by the government and UNHCR, they tend to be moved, depending on their level of insecurity, again, to Kigoma transit camps, Kigoma towns, or in Dar es Salaam. And there are those who, for one reason or the other, they did not go through the RISD process or through the refugee status determination process. They just decided to come and hide in Dar es Salaam, and then for their safety, security safety. And when they approach, for example, Salaam Access, we tell them, okay, go to government and register yourself, present yourself to UNHCR, and we tell them they will wait that they would guarantee their legal status in Dar es Salaam. So again, on that question, it depends on the level of insecurity of someone. But in terms of eviction, I don't know if I got well that question, but I would say there is so much risk of being evicted from the house if the landlord, for example, if the landlord say or feels that you are in danger to him or her, or if you are not paying the rent, or if they just thought that you are not a refugee and then they realized later that you are a refugee and they don't know much about refugees, so they misperceive, they feel that refugees are bandits, they are not good people. They can evict you from the house, or the house rent could be arbitrarily, raised high. So those are the problem of evictions in Dar es Salaam.
Yeah.
You want to add?
Yeah, just mentioning about the evictions, like we had interviewed several people who had issues with that in terms of, it's similar to what happens in the schools, that when they move into a property, a lot of the time, if they think they can manage to conceal the fact that they're refugees, then they do so, and then it happens sometimes later on that as Nondo said, the landlord discovers that they're a refugee, and regardless of whether they've been good tenants or not, then they're evicted just because of this idea, discrimination around refugees or putting up the price. But we also had a couple of instances as well where it became more serious. So one refugee we spoke, and there had actually been accused of raping one of the people related to the landlords that they were renting the house from, and it went to court, and it was a really long, terrible process, and he was exonerated eventually, but and it was all related to discrimination with refugees, and they just really didn't want them in the house, and this kind of situation escalated and snowballed out of all proportion. It was just one more extreme example of how things can escalate in these situations. But certainly, I think most of the refugees that we spoke to, as Nondo said, are really trying to keep a low profile, and a lot of them had moved several times in Dar es Salaam. I don't think we spoke to anyone who had just been in the one property since they'd come to the city. It seemed they were quite resigned to the fact that they would have to move pretty regularly because of these issues.
Okay, this is so great. Protiti, I'm going to just hold up you for 1 second, because I really do want to ask all of you, as you answer these questions, one thing we haven't talked about too much, and I'm curious to know for your three cities, just briefly, if you could say, in each of these cities, would you say that different groups of refugees, different national groups maybe, or live in different parts, different neighborhoods of the city, or are people kind of evenly distributed throughout the city? Protiti, could you, I know Burmese live in some parts of Delhi and Somalis in others. Could you talk a little bit about that, how this map of Delhi looks when it comes to refugee groups?
Oh, that's so complicated, but I'll try. So the first wave of refugees in modern history came in 47 with the partition. So they came from present-day Pakistan. They settled in and around the places where the former so all the Hindus from Pakistan came into India, and the Muslims from India went into Pakistan, and both the governments had an exchange program of exchanging property. So a Muslim person who had left a house behind in Delhi took the house of a Hindu person in Pakistan, and vice versa. So a lot of those refugees now live in and around the older parts of town, and also there were some areas that were set aside as refugee settlement areas, and a lot of those communities now live there. And now, those areas have prospered over time, and now they are like nice locations. In more modern times, the Tibetans came when the Tibetans came, they were given specific areas where they could live. This happened to be in the northern part of Delhi, and they still live there, and that's where all the Tibetan markets are, where the Tibetan restaurants are. It's close to the Delhi University area, so this was exclusively for them. Then they started coming in a wave of refugees, started with the Afghans in the first phase, which was about 30 30 years from now, so the late 80s, early 90s, they took a different part of town. And since then, it's not just the Afghan refugees who come and live there, but today, Afghan traders will live in those parts. The people who visit from Afghanistan for, say, medical reasons, for medical tourism, or for generally to as economic migrants or otherwise, they all settle in those parts of town. When the second wave of Afghan refugees came in the 2000s, they somehow did not settle there. They started living, then that was partly because that area has been saturated now with people living there, so they moved a little further south. And that was also a time when a lot of NGOs started coming up for refugee aid and to do provide all kinds of refugee services, from legal services to job placements and generally to distribute clothes maybe. So any kind of services that NGOs could provide to refugees, all of that started happening in the 2000s. And so what happened that thereafter refugees started coming into localities where these NGOs were working. So now there's this stretch of road in the southwest of Delhi called Khirki Extension. It's a very rundown, shabby area across the road from this really swanky mall that's come up. And there are Iraqis, Iranians, there are Somalis, there are Afghans, there are just so many communities living there because the NGOs all have their offices there. So that is sort of how the communities have been mapping themselves out. The only exception now is the Rohingyas, who just came in over the last 2-3 years, and they have sort of been secluded in this very remote part of town close to where the river sort of leaves the city, and it's not a very hygienic place to stay. But they're all there, and it's because of the tensions that have been happening in India generally, the religious tensions, and also because Rohingyas have worldwide been identified as this as the Muslims who were leaving Burma. They have just been put in this little corner, and they don't interact with anybody. Nobody interacts with them, and they're just over there. They just do these little odd jobs to support each other, and that's how they are surviving.
Wow, that's so fascinating, Protiti. It's really interesting how spatiality affects protection and the experience over time. We have just a few minutes left. Could I ask you others to talk briefly about the way refugees are mapped across the cities? Let's start with, yeah.
Okay, I would like to talk about Cape Town. Basically, you find that refugees from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, and maybe to some extent Malawi easily integrate into the townships of South Africa, where the black people of South Africa are. For example, let me explain it this way. When I came into South Africa for the very first time, I speak Shona from Zimbabwe, and then even if a South African is speaking in Xhosa or Zulu or say Sotho, I can pick up some words and I can relate to whatever they are saying. Unlike a person from Congo, Nigeria, and so on. This is because in Southern Africa there's a certain cluster of languages known as the Bantu languages. They are quite related. For example, the word for a person, in Shona I say Munu, and then you would find that the word Umuntu is used in Zulu, it's in Xhosa, it's also in Ndebele, that is spoken in Zimbabwe, okay? And Xhosa and Zulu are spoken in South Africa. So for Zimbabweans, it's easier to integrate into the townships, so you would find Zimbabweans are all over. The same applies to people from Lesotho, the same applies to people from Swaziland. But then with the Somalis, they can't speak these languages, and also based on differences in religion and so on, you would find that the Somalis have preferred to cluster within a place called Bellevue, and it's actually nicknamed Somtown for Somali Town, or some people call it Little Mogadishu, because I mean, like, it just has a huge Somali population. And then the Congolese as well, because they speak French and maybe languages like Lingala and so on that are quite divorced from this cluster of Bantu languages. They find it quite difficult to integrate within the townships where the black population of South Africa are. So you would find that these people stay in certain groups on their own as well. So like within Cape Town, you would find them clustering along Fort Tracker Road in areas like Tyro and Maitland. And then the moment you mention parklands in Cape Town, people would sort of identify it with Nigerians. I don't know, for some reason, you just find like Nigerians prefer to stay within that area. So there are these distinctive groups, except for people from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Swaziland, who are just fitting within the townships and everywhere else.
It's really fascinating how language and ethnicity and nationality create these spatial clusters throughout the city that you can actually walk through and experience. Ashlyn and Nondo, I know we ended up not doing a map of the refugee population in Dar for safety reasons, but maybe you can speak just generally about whether clustering is occurring and kind of why that is, if it's a security thing or a low-income housing thing, what's causing that?
So can you come again?
So do you want to talk real briefly about just spatially how refugees are either clustering or distributed evenly throughout the city, and what's causing that? And that'll wrap us up for the webinar.
I would start by saying that first is the policies. The policies. We have a strict policy in place that all refugees. We have an incumbent policy in place, and so this incumbent policy makes it difficult for even Tanzanians, even for those Tanzanians who would want to integrate refugees easily. It makes it difficult for them to welcome refugees in the city, and they are also afraid of the fact that if they are seen as refugees in the city, that would cause problems. But also, there's no much education on refugees, so there's so much misinterpretation of the meaning of a refugee, who is a refugee, and so the people do not much understand of whether refugee is a legal status of someone to be in the country. So they think a refugee is just someone who is not mentally fit, for example, and someone who doesn't like his country or her country of origin, someone who commits, someone who's a criminal. So all these misunderstandings, they make refugees being misinterpreted, discriminated against, and but also another problem that causes that is that the city is so people don't know who is really a Tanzanian and who is not. So it could be easy for refugees, for example, to pretend to be Tanzanians and to live that way. So all these are reasons why refugees are discriminated against. So there's no that much proper screening mechanism For example, for the Burundians, we have a tribe here in Tanzania called Wa or Ha tribe, and they speak the same language with refugees. So it could be easy for Burundian refugees to come to Dar es Salaam and say, I'm from Wa tribe or I'm from Wa ethnicity, and nobody would want to question. So all those things are among the things that make refugees being discriminated against in Dar es Salaam. Ashling, do you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I think Charles was also asking about where they were located in the city. So we decided not to release the location of the refugees for safety reasons, because, as Nondo mentioned, that there's an encampment policy in Tanzania. So unless refugees get a camp permit, which is quite difficult to get to leave the camps, then they shouldn't be in Dar es Salaam, really. So that was why we chose not to release the case study location. But from what we found, the refugees generally seem to be distributed across the city. I think partly because of security reasons, that they would have become too conspicuous if a large population of one ethnicity or one group of refugees had been living in a certain area, would have drawn attention to them. So I think that was one of the reasons. And we found that as well from the focus groups we did, refugees, for example, there wasn't a large kind of refugee community or organization connecting people that well in Dar es Salaam, because people were very kind of slow to trust other people and just wanted to kind of keep themselves and keep a low profile. So that also prevented, I think, people from congregating in one particular region or, developing really different organizations that might provide more support for them. Most people, for example, only went to, say, church organizations when they came to Dar es Salaam if they looked for any support at all. But several people said to us that, they were, in terms of like making friends with Tanzanians or just making friends generally, they were very cautious about, expanding their social network too far, because they felt like it would expose them to potentially being outed as refugees, basically. So they were very conscious all the time of security, and I think that has come out in terms of especially where they are across the city, that they tend not to be distributed, tend not to be, grouped in one particular region. I don't know if you have any stick with that.
No.
Okay, yes, I think we're going to need to wrap up. You guys have been really great, so interesting to compare these three cities. Two of them without camps, one of them in a country with an encampment policy, where we're seeing much more problems for refugees in Dar. We are going to, we encourage you to read the reports and the case studies of these cities. We are going to build on these cities. We are hoping to have additional case studies that explore some of these issues in Delhi and in Dar, possibly in Cape Town or elsewhere in South Africa. So stand by for those. We're going to close this now. Let me see. Thank you again so much to our four correspondents and our researchers. Wonderful anecdotes and passions that you're telling us about. Charles, anything to add?
No, thank you all again to our panelists. We have 4 panelists in 4 different time zones, so these are not easy to put on. We appreciate everyone's flexibility on this, and thanks to the attendees for your interest, your questions. Again, I recommend you take a look at the reports, and if you have interest in developing case studies elsewhere, we're always looking for more. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.